Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and thank you for joining us on another episode of Living History. I'm really excited about this episode, but it's going to be a little bit unusual because I wanted to talk about my new book that's just come out, Krithia, about this terrible and virtually forgotten Anzac battle at Gallipoli. But I was going to find it a bit hard to interview myself, so I've actually gotten someone else to come in who's going to interview me about the book. So I will be doing a lot of the talking this time, and my interviewer, not my guest, but the host today is someone who I'm sure you all know. It's a good mate of mine. It's Ray Martin. Ray, thanks so much for coming on the show.
No, pleasure, Matty. It's an extraordinary book. I read it in about 2 nights, which is a credit to you. But I do remember back in 2015, the centenary of Gallipoli, you led a team, and I was included in that. We did some wonderful stuff. We went back to Turkey in general, but we also one Sunday, I remember, you took us with your family and my son, and we went to Krithia, and there was this just little tiny village, Turkish village, and I remember it was a late April, of course, and it was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and we got ice creams. We were standing in the square there of Krithia, I remember I took photographs of a rooster that was sort of on patrol in the marketplace in there, and I think we even went to the cemetery afterwards. Did you know at the time the importance of Krithia in Gallipoli?
Yeah, I did, Ray. I mean, I remember that day. I've got those same photos, I think, of the rooster patrolling the streets of the village that was destroyed in this battle. And I think, it's hard when you know a topic so well for such a long period of time. I'm trying to remember, but I think I took us there because I knew Krithia so well. And in fact, when I was writing my Gallipoli guidebook, maybe 2009, I finished that book. But I remember I went over with my good mate Todd Prees, and he and I were in Gallipoli, and we actually walked the entire Krithia battlefield in the footsteps of the Anzacs. And I told a few of my British mates about it, and they were saying, "Oh, that's a brilliant idea. I don't think anyone's actually done that before." But walked not just where the fighting was, but the entire battlefield from the point where the Anzacs landed to where they camped overnight, to where they began their advance, and where so many of them died and now lie in that cemetery. So that was a really interesting perspective. So it's one of those things that I think for a long time now has been a story that has resonated with me, but it's only now that I've had the opportunity to tell it in this book form. And I'm really proud, actually. I do have to say that at the outset. I'm really proud of having written this book because it's such an important story.
It's an extraordinary story.
And these guys deserve to be known.
But you said a forgotten battle. Why forgotten? Was it because it was such a disaster, or why? Why don't we know about it?
That's a great question. I mean, why is it forgotten? It says on the cover of the book, the Forgotten Anzac Battle. And, no disrespect, but publishers do this a lot to try and sell books. Yep. This one I was very happy with, though. It genuinely is forgotten. You ask an Aussie or a New Zealander about Krithia, and they've never heard of it.
Well, I went through my library last night of Gallipoli books, and I must have 30 or more. They all mention the so-called Second Battle of Krithia, but that's all. It's just a bypass, almost like it was a skirmish off to one side. We're talking about 2,500 Anzacs who were either killed or wounded there.
I think the reason that it's there's a couple of reasons it's forgotten, if we use that term. The battles aren't usually measured in terms of sacrifice. The fact that you lost a lot of men doesn't, at the end of the day in the history books, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be remembered. I think it was simply because it was one of 6 or 7 attempts that were made with mostly British and French troops to capture the village of Krithia.
Why was it important?
It wasn't important. I think that's the thing, and I think that's part of the story, that it was one of just a series of attempts that all went disastrously wrong, and they never achieved the objective. They never captured the village of Krithia, and even had they captured the village of Krithia, so what? It didn't mean anything. It was a pile of rubble on a featureless plain. It didn't actually mean anything. But we have this terrible thing, and it was revealed to me as I wrote the book, of what we call objective creep, which is when, because you are struggling to capture an objective, the importance of that objective grows in your mind. And I think it's probably something we all relate to every day, probably through our work or our studies or things like, when you can't achieve something, the importance of it grows and grows and grows until it becomes the objective in your own mind. And then you forget the big picture, which is, it's actually not that important. The fact that I haven't captured it is a shame, but it's actually not that important in the big scheme of things. And that's the Battle of Krithia. The village itself and the hill next to it, Archie Barber, that were the 2 objectives, meant very little in and of themselves. They were only important because we had failed to capture them.
Now, I should say too that it's a novel approach to write a book through the diaries of 3 men, 3 soldiers, one a Pom, one a Kiwi, one an Australian. But as well as that, you've gone back and you've used diaries and documents from the Turkish side. So it's almost shone a light on this unknown area.
Well, thank you. It's what I wanted to do. I kind of came up with that formula, if you want to call it that, with my last book, The Cowra Breakout. But that was a bit unintentional. That came about because I was telling the story of Japanese prisoners of war who eventually broke out of the prison camp at Cowra. And I wanted to flesh them out more because we always spoke about these prisoners as these sort of 2-dimensional fanatics. And I wanted to tell their story as humans. And I actually was fortunate to find a couple of memoirs that enabled me to do that. And so I decided to dedicate some chapters to individual characters who would have a big effect on the Cowra Breakout. And I thought that worked really, really well. So even though that had been mostly an accident, I asked myself the question, could I do that here instead of just portraying the Anzacs in quote marks as these bronzed Aussies and Kiwis who've come to win the war and kissed their girlfriends and rode off the family farm? I thought, can I tell a bit more of a deep story about them? And I thought, well, can I find individuals who represent what everyone went through at Krithia? And I was lucky that I found excellent diaries that did that. But I also wanted to do the same thing from the Turkish perspective, but wasn't quite able to achieve that simply because a lot of the Turkish enlisted men were illiterate. They weren't very well educated. They didn't write very much. Those records have not survived.
And they come from the Middle East and as well as Turkey, so they all spoke
exactly. They
different
were from Syria and Iran and Iraq and Palestine and all over the place. And so there just wasn't the same group of records, and we haven't done as much research on the Turkish side as we've done on the Anzac side. So I wanted to feature a Turkish soldier who'd been through this experience. Sadly, I couldn't do that, but what we did have was a number of excellent historians, Harvey Broadbent and Edward Eriksson, and a few others and a number of Turkish historians have been delving in the past decade or so in the Turkish archives and bringing more of the story to life. So through those records and through some excellent memoirs of Turkish officers, I was able to give a Turkish perspective, not quite in as much detail as the Aussie and New Zealand and British perspective, but I was able to tell that story. And the French as well. We shouldn't forget the French at Gallipoli. Yep. The French also didn't leave excellent records from their time at Gallipoli. But I was able to draw on enough of those French accounts and those French sources to paint that picture as well, because it was collaborative. We tend to focus on it just as an Anzac adventure. It wasn't. It was a big collaboration.
And you mentioned Indians as well. Quite a few Indian troops come in.
Yeah, exactly. They by the time of this battle, they weren't their role wasn't particularly dominant at Gallipoli, but it would become much more so later on. So we, certainly, I probably didn't do them enough justice, but I certainly included them in the story.
You mentioned the top three. A sidebar of the story, we get an insight into the Australians when they get to Egypt, of the racism and the way they put down the Egyptians, basic as lesser beings.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that was important to include a number of the diary entries. In fact, I'd say it's almost universal that Australian diary entries before Gallipoli, when they're training in Egypt, talk about the natives. Yeah. And I got to say, that's the kindest word they often use about them. You'd have to do some heavy editing to enable that to go through. But that's a common theme. And I thought, well, why shy away from that? Why shy away from the fact that the Australians didn't get on with the native people of Egypt? They didn't like them. They found them dirty. They were very racist against them. Ray, what I always want to do is not to paint these people as two-dimensional plastic heroes. We do them an injustice when we do that. These were human beings who had complicated lives and feelings and thoughts. Let's tell their true story rather than just, grouping them in again in that sort of two-dimensional way.
And they're men, especially the Aussie and the New Zealander, they come from white Australia or white New Zealand. They really hadn't come across anyone from just Anglo-Irish background.
Yeah, absolutely. And they see themselves, at least in part. We probably overplay this a little bit, but there is a reality there that there was a very strong connection to Britain. So they would often call themselves, I'm a good Australian, but I'm a good Briton as well, living in what they saw as a bit of an outpost in the Asia-Pacific region of Britain. This was a big motivator for people to go and fight. And we do overplay it a little bit, but it still is an important consideration of the lives that these men were living.
All right, let's go back to Krithia then, this so-called second battle. The Allies lose 21,000 men, and yet they never reach the village. They don't actually reach the Turkish lines at that stage. It's only 6 k's from the coast, and yet they lose 21,000 men for absolutely nothing.
We can't overstate what a disaster Gallipoli was. Through the lens of, more than a century, we look back on it, and how can I put this? You just kind of think that's how it was. The Anzacs landed, they got, they fought on Second Ridge at Lone Pine and the Neck and these famous places. The British and French were fighting down at Cape Helis and they were struggling to capture this hill called Archie Barber. And we just kind of think, well, that's the way it was. But we have to remember it wasn't supposed to be that way. This was supposed to be a very rapid advance in both sectors across the peninsula. Yeah. On the first day, the Australians were supposed to have captured kilometres of ground that they never captured in the entire campaign. The British were the same. We cannot overstate what a disaster the Gallipoli campaign was. And we have to remember that. And hopefully this book sheds a bit of light on that. That
it does indeed.
It was just an appalling miscalculation to even launch the campaign.
But you need the details that you've gone to in this book, don't you? Otherwise we can, for a long time now, we've always thought the British commanders were incompetent in Gallipoli anyway. That's the general picture of it. But it's only when you get the sort of detail of what happens on Helis, for example, and you go into Anzac Cove as well, that, is it fair to say that Gallipoli is one of the great, I know it's a big call, one of the great disasters in British military history?
Oh yeah, it's well up there in one of. You'd have to say there's quite a few contenders for the greatest. It definitely one of. The whole thing was a disaster. Nothing went right at Gallipoli. There was no aspect of the campaign except for the evacuation that you could say went according to plan, and we achieved what we set out to do. Nothing from start to finish.
In all the stuff you've written, all the stuff you've read, all the kilometres you've walked, are you convinced that Churchill really saw that as a backdoor way into taking over Germany, given there was a stalemate on the Western Front, or was it simply a diversion?
I think they were genuine in their efforts to try and win the war. I don't fault the British planners for that. And as I say in the book, by 1915, the situation at the start of 1915 is absolute stalemate on the Western Front, which no one ever could have anticipated. Our Russian allies are struggling on the Eastern Front against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. At the start of 1915, you look at the First World War and it's a disaster. And you think, how are we getting a way out of this? The Germans are occupying nearly all of Belgium and huge chunks of northern France. We can't kick them out. What the hell are we going to do? And so, as I said in the book, I think I put it that ideas that would be considered risky or even harebrained started to get more attention. And I think that's where Gallipoli comes in. Gallipoli would not have been a suggestion. Before the war, if the British had a strategic plan that involved forcing the Dardanelles, I think they would have, thrown that plan off the table. But by 1915, they did need to do something. And the British had launched...
the whole plans are made within, 3 weeks to invade Gallipoli?
So I always say that D-Day, the world's largest amphibious operation during World War II, took 2 years to plan. Prior to the Second World War, Gallipoli was the largest amphibious operation in history, and it was planned in 3 weeks. So it was born out of desperation. And I won't fault the British commanders for trying to come up with a way of winning the war. That was their goal. It wasn't a folly. They wanted to win the war. Had they been able to succeed in Gallipoli the way they wanted to, it would have been a huge issue for the Germans and our enemies. I don't think it would have knocked them out of the war. I don't think it would have, it wouldn't have instantly ended the war, but it would have created a huge issue for the Germans and their allies had we succeeded at Gallipoli. But we're getting into what ifs. It was never, the answer is it was never going to succeed. It was a terrible plan and terribly executed. Not to take anything away from the men. That's what I always have to stress. The men were magnificent, and we remember the men who were fighting at Gallipoli.
On both sides.
Yeah, absolutely on both sides, in spite of these circumstances, not because of them. So we never take anything away from the men. It was an incredible accomplishment, but the plans and the leadership and the whole thing was a fiasco.
Matt, you make the point that day one, when the Anzacs land, Birdwood, who's in charge of the Australians at that stage, he wants to evacuate straight away. Day one.
Yeah.
And they stay for another 8 months.
The first night. And again, as I said in the book, because there's no, Ray, as you know, the facts don't change. After a century, the facts aren't going to change. All we have is our interpretation of those facts. And the one thing I did want to stress is that I think Birdwood is often misrepresented. So he sent what could be considered a bit of a panicky telegram on the first night of the campaign, saying if we are going to evacuate, we have to do it quickly, because I think if the Turks are going to counterattack, and I don't think we can hold them. So if we're going to evacuate, we have to do it quickly. And I think it's often been misinterpreted as Birdwood getting a bit panicky. Oh my God, this hasn't gone well and we're in trouble. I give him the break of saying I don't think that was the case. My suggestion, what I interpret that is actually a sensible military discussion. If this part of the campaign is not going as we wanted it to, are these resources better employed elsewhere on the peninsula? And it's actually a sensible question. If the Anzacs could have been evacuated and re-employed at Helis, for example, that probably would have turned the tide of the campaign. The point is, of course, they couldn't have been evacuated without an absolute slaughter overnight in the dark with the Turks right on top of them. So
which they do. Back in December comes and they manage to do it perfectly.
Yeah, after weeks of planning, but so I think, again, as you say, there's a couple of things that point out how badly Gallipoli went. The first is that suggestion that on the first night of the campaign, Birdwood was suggesting evacuation. But also, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the British never captured the village of Krithia, at Cape Helles. By the time they evacuated in January 1916, they were still nearly 2 kilometres short of the village of Krithia, and Krithia was their objective for the first day.
Well, let's go to that, to the strategy, the British strategy. Again, you make the point that at Anzac Cove, we reach that stage where the Turks and the Allies, mainly Australians and New Zealanders, are fighting hand-to-hand, grenades, bayonets. Down at Helis, down at Krithia, they don't even see the eyes of the Turks that far. They never actually, in the 21,000 men lost, and they never reach the lines.
Yeah, it's a very different battlefield, and it's something that I think as Aussies we probably failed to grasp, that A, it wasn't all about the fighting at Anzac, and B, that what you could probably consider the main battlefront of the Gallipoli campaign, Cape Helles at the southern toe, was a very different landscape. It was very open, it was farmland. There was still a lot of valleys and gullies and things, but it wasn't this torturous, impossible landscape that we see at Anzac. And because of that, the Allied lines were a fair distance apart. So you didn't have those problems you had at Anzac with an enemy right on top of you. But it also created this huge issue that any advance against your enemy meant covering a big distance. And that was the problem at Krithia.
And they're on the high ground.
Yeah, the Turks are on the high ground. Not as high as at Anzac, but they're high enough that they can see everything the British are doing. And any time you leave your trenches to advance against them, they can see you coming, and you've got a lot of ground to cover. And that was the issue at Helis.
But Matt, you make the point that when the landing happens heading towards Krithia, the Allies have a huge advantage. I think you said something like 60 to 1 in terms of troops. They have the big guns on the ships that the Turks don't have at that stage. So every reason to think that we're going to succeed.
Yeah, they absolutely should have. And I think in hindsight, the Allies should have succeeded. If we look at some of those figures, so the Anzac landing, we put in the covering force about 3,000 troops ashore in the opening, let's say, hour of the landing on Anzac Day 1915. The Turks, immediately defending against that initial wave, had 160 men in defence.
Against 3,000.
Against 3,000. Yeah. So this shows it shows the bravery of the Turks. We talk about Gallipoli too much just from our side. The huge factor, if we summed it up in one statement, why did Gallipoli fail? The incredible defence of the Turks. That was the reason that it didn't work. And if you look at Helis, we landed on 5 beaches at Cape Helis. An entire division landed, an entire British division. So you're talking there probably, you're talking 15,000 combat troops. Could be as many as, well, let's say 15,000 because not every troop was employed. Let's say about 15,000 British troops coming ashore in that first wave. And the Turks had 1 company defending there. So maximum, say, 300 men. And you're talking against, it could be 12, 15,000 that were coming ashore. Like just ridiculous numbers. And yet the Turks held them up enough. Obviously, the factor is a lot of reinforcements then arrived very quickly. So the numbers evened out very quickly on the opening day.
But time is the essence, as you say. Time
is of the essence. If you talk about an amphibious landing, it's a race. How many troops can we get ashore before our enemy can bring up reinforcements? It's just absolutely a race. So when we talk about things like D-Day, a huge part of the D-Day planning was disrupting the ability for the Germans to bring reinforcements in while the Allies established a beachhead. Well, nothing like that went on at Gallipoli. There was nothing to stop the Turks streaming in reinforcements as soon as they knew where the Allies were, and that's exactly what they did.
But even from day one, when they come ashore, within the hours, 150 odd Turks with machine guns just wipe out the Brits as they come ashore.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no machine guns at the landing, which is the other thing as well. All rifle fire. So we now know from the Turkish records that in spite of everything that's been said, the Turks, both at Helis and Anzac, did not have machine guns opposing the landing. So it was all just Turks with rifles and guts holding back the Allies.
You make the point the same here as at Anzac Cove, that part of the problem is when you're taking back dead and wounded men back to the ship, it holds up the rest of the troops who are waiting to come ashore.
Yeah, the disasters start to compound when things go wrong. So during the landings, the huge unexpected numbers of wounded, obviously the dead are bad enough, but I don't want this to sound callous, but dead are actually not too much of an issue because you don't have to do anything with them straight away. Wounded, you do have to do something with straight away. You have to treat them. And therefore, boats that should have been just bringing in reinforcements were now laden with wounded going back to hospital ships, and so that slowed down the landing. So it's a compounding problem that as small things go wrong, they start to add up, and then everything starts to go wrong.
There's the belief too that the big British ships and French ships with the big guns are going to basically quieten the Turks.
Yeah,
it doesn't
absolutely.
work.
No, it doesn't work basically because of intelligence. They can't tell where the Turks are. The Turks are hidden away in gullies and ravines and mostly shielded from gunfire from the ships, and the ships fire in a very flat trajectory. So it can't, if you're dug in a trench or in a gully or something, the shells can't actually hit you very effectively. So no, everything I think what we can say is everything the British and the Anzacs assumed about the landing didn't happen.
And you say assume because there's no reconnaissance, is there?
No, exactly.
They know nothing, and part of the point you make is there's no information. They don't know where the Turks are, how many there are, or where they've got to go.
They expected, the British intelligence said that in order to guard the beaches at Cape Helis, they would need an entire division of Turkish troops. So again, we're talking 12,000 defenders, something like that. Anywhere between 10 to 15,000. They need an entire division to guard the whole sector of Cape Helis.
And they do it with a couple of hundred.
In reality, there was a Turkish division, but it was spread over the entire peninsula. So at Helis, there were only hundreds of troops, and at Anzac, there was only 160. So, but I should make the point, not for very long. The Turkish plan was lightly garrison the coast as soon as we see where the landings are coming, send in reinforcements. And the issue the British in particular made was the landings were too far apart to be mutually supportive. So each landing ended up fighting its own little battle immediately in front of it.
Hi, this is Christopher Kimball from Milk Street Radio. I often shop at Whole Foods Market since they sell the kind of food I like. Organic vegetables, a great meat counter, and of course a great staff. For Thanksgiving, Whole Foods offers brine turkeys, as well as a spiral-cut bone-in ham. The Whole Foods Market Bakery has a large assortment of pies, even a vegan pumpkin pie, or grab some brioche and butterflake rolls for the table as well. Or you can ask the Whole Foods team to cater your meal for you, including the bird, the sides, and desserts. Get your holiday party started at Whole Foods Market.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Talk to me about this extraordinary saga of the River Clyde, the boat. It becomes almost a metaphor for disaster.
It does indeed, and the historic irony just can't be overlooked, that from the Gallipoli Peninsula you look across to ancient Troy, where the famous Trojan horse, and I don't know if that was the inspiration of the British, but they concocted their own Trojan horse at Cape Helles. They got an old collier, this old steamer, filled it full of 2,000 troops and ran it ashore at Cape Helles at V Beach. And then they'd cut what they call sally ports, so special doors into the hull. They lowered gangways. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. Lowered gangways. Then they had pontoon boats come in and they sort of lashed bridges across the pontoon boats. And the idea was 2,000 men would come streaming out of the River Clyde and overwhelm the Turkish defenders. It was a disaster. Imagine under fire trying to lower gangways and men in boats trying to string walkways together. It was just an absolute disaster, a slaughter, an absolute slaughter. And as soon as these little doors opened, the Turks just knew they had to aim on the door.
But again, from rifles, not from machine guns.
From rifles, no machine guns. Only rifles. But if you've got a couple of hundred blokes all firing very accurately at one point, like a door in the side of a ship, and there's 200 of them each with a rifle, it's going to be the same effect as machine gun fire anyway.
And the River Clyde stays there. It becomes almost a refuge for troops.
Yeah, the sentinel on the beach in some ways. And so when the Australians eventually arrived to come and fight in this area, they unloaded right next to the battered hull of the River Clyde and stayed there for the entire campaign. In fact, the entire war. It wasn't refloated until after the war.
The other thing I mentioned that the detail is tells it all, and you've gone to the detail in this particular book. But I had no idea that the shortage of shells was such a major issue there, that they haven't produced enough shells back in the factories to supply the ships. And so as a result, all the invasion is done, or the campaign is done without the coverage of artillery.
Yeah, that was the one lesson they had learnt by 1915, was that the First World War was going to be about artillery, because if you've got entrenchments and machine guns and barbed wire, you have to destroy them to have any chance of an attack being successful. And the only way to do that is with artillery. And so what you're describing is what was known as the shell crisis, where basically the problem was that there were so many guns and they fired shells so quickly that the factories couldn't keep up. So after the first 6 months of the war, there was a real issue that the British were running out of shells. And most of the time when we talk about the shell crisis, as it was called, we talk about it on the Western Front, how there were not enough guns to support attacks going on in France. But at Gallipoli, it was ridiculous. They didn't arrive with enough shells for the guns because they didn't expect it to be a long campaign. So they didn't bring many shells with them to begin with. And they couldn't get reinforced. They couldn't get more shells, couldn't get more supplies because all the supplies were going to France. So it was a disaster. So every attack at Gallipoli was supposed to be, had it been on the Western Front, there would have been a huge bombardment to smash the Turkish lines. It was embarrassing at Gallipoli, a feeble little display of artillery fire, and then the men went in against machine guns. Just
and you
terrible.
seem to describe it as not quite this, but we've got 10 shells. That's all we've got.
Yeah.
They're limiting the number of shells. We can't do this. We've got to just ignore it and let the men run into open fire.
Well, there's a great Australian gunner, artillery gunner called Les Goldring, who left a fantastic diary, and I used parts of that. But he was very he kept a good tally of what they were doing every day. And there was just one line that I just put in there that I included in the book, which just said, guns started firing, fired for 90 minutes, then ordered to cease firing, never fired again for the rest of the day. So you've got an attack going on. Yep. You've got gunners there with artillery pieces that are supposed to be supporting infantry. They fire for 90 minutes in the morning and then don't shoot for the rest of the day.
So it's May 7, and the campaign's only less than a month old. In
10 days old.
10 days old
yeah.
in Anzac Cove. The Anzacs are holding on only, barely, and then they call two of their prime units, the Kiwis and the Australians, down to Hillis. Why?
Yeah, this is where we start getting into this story that I would say that most Australians and New Zealanders don't know, and this is where it starts to get really fascinating. So the British had not succeeded in capturing their objectives when they'd landed, and they needed reinforcements desperately to keep pushing the attack. And so General Hamilton, the commander, the overall commander of the force, ordered General Birdwood, the Anzac commander, to send 2 entire brigades of Anzacs to Cape Helles to assist in the advance on Krithia.
Probably the best men we've got.
Yeah, send your best men down because we need to capture this village of Krithia. And so Birdwood selected the entire New Zealand brigade, so every New Zealand infantryman who was fighting at Gallipoli. This is the thing that amazes the Kiwis. Every New Zealand infantryman who was fit and well and fighting at Gallipoli at this time was sent to Cape Helles to fight in the Battle of Krithia.
Well, do they mention in their histories the New Zealanders?
They do, but in the same way we do, with a sort of a cursory fashion that it was a huge disaster and not much was gained. And the Australian 2nd Brigade was sent down as well. So to give some context to that, we had 5 brigades of infantry at Anzac at this time.
40% of the troops.
So 2 of the 5. So the 5 brigades had not been enough to get anywhere near their objectives, and they're only just holding on against the Turks right on top of them. And then the order is take 2 of the 5 and send them down to Cape Helles to reinforce the British down there.
Does Birdwood say, well, we've lost, we can't possibly hold on with 60%?
He was remarkably restrained when he received this order to do it. I read his personal diary so he receives this order from his commanding officer, General Hamilton, to release 40% of his entire force to get into Cape Helles. He was remarkably restrained, but he did put that he was a little bit nervous about trying to hold the line. So they did get some reinforcements. They did get a smattering of troops from the British Royal Naval Division and other things. But it was not only it should have led to disaster. The Turks, the Anzac garrison was now so under strength, having removed 2 entire brigades of the 5 that were there. The Turks should have broken through and overwhelmed them. We just got really lucky that in the couple of weeks those 2 brigades were down at Helles. The Turks didn't realise how thin the Anzac line was.
And again, the detail, they get 14 boats, I think you say, that ship the Anzacs, the Aussies and New Zealanders down to Hillis. Again, that could have been disaster.
Yeah, this is one of the things, Ray, that I was sort of proud of that I revealed in the book. This idea that if you write a history book, you should contribute something to the knowledge base. Well, this is one of the things that I was proud that I contributed was I dedicated an entire chapter to the Anzacs leaving the Anzac sector and sailing 20 kilometres south to Cape Helles because it was such a stuff-up. It was so badly managed, such a disaster, that it should have led to huge casualties, but we were just lucky that it didn't because half the boats didn't arrive in time. So all the Anzac, the 2 brigades marched down to Anzac Cove. They were supposed to just get on lighters, which would take them out to the big ships, and off they'd go. The troops arrived on the beach, but the big ships weren't there. So they couldn't do anything. There was no ships to take them to Helis. The ships were late arriving. And so the men, the best part of 5,000 Anzacs, just hung around, loitered on the beach. A couple of Turkish shells dropped on them could have caused hundreds of casualties. But luckily the Turks never realised that there were 5,000 men.
The Turkish records don't show that there's a movement there of 5,000 men and what's happening?
They didn't notice any difference from what was going on. So the Anzacs, well, they did well to cover it up, but gee, they got lucky that the Turks didn't realise there were... I mean, anyone who's been to Anzac Cove knows that it's tiny. Imagine 5,000 men jammed onto that sand.
In amongst the...
For hours waiting for boats that weren't there.
In amongst the hospital...
hospitals, supplies, huge mountains of stores, piers, boats coming in to take off wounded, the whole cacophony of everything that was going on at Anzac Cove. And then an extra 5,000 men jammed in there, it could have been a disaster. Should have been a disaster.
So the 5,000 get to Helis, and they, again, could have been... slaughtered getting off the ships. They come up there and they watch the British and the French being slaughtered in front of them.
Yeah, so the what we're talking about here is the 2nd Battle of Krithia. So the first battle occurred in the days immediately after the landing, and it's pretty generous to call it a battle because basically the British just advanced. British and French, I should say. French on the right, British on the left. The British and French advanced just basically into heavy fire from an enemy they couldn't see. That's a really important point. They didn't know where the Turks were. And most of the fire was coming from outposts, not even from the main Turkish line. So the first Battle of Krithia was a disaster. So Hamilton asked for these reinforcements to launch what would become the second Battle of Krithia. So that's what we're talking about. The second Battle of Krithia, which took place over 3 days in the first week of May, the 6th, 7th and 8th of May.
By this stage, the Turks have brought machine guns in.
Yes.
And they've got some artillery.
Absolutely.
And again, you point out I know it becomes a tactic. The tactic is to single out the officers and snipers knock off the officers.
Yeah, the Turks are very good at that. Again, most of these troops are inexperienced that were fighting at Gallipoli. Later on the Western Front, officers would wear enlisted men's clothing and simply have a very subtle badge indicating that they're an officer. At Gallipoli, they're wearing their full officer gear, with caps and the whole thing. The officers were very, very brave. We shouldn't take this away from the men. The officers were leading from the front, but that made them targets, obviously. And so the issue was that we simply didn't know where the Turks were. The reason there was this impetus, the rush to keep pushing the attack, was because every day that went by, the Turks brought up more men to defend against future attacks. But also the Turks were digging frontline trenches. There were no trenches there at the time of the landing. So the Turks had to create a defensive trench system. And the Allies knew that the more time we gave them, the deeper the defences would be. So again, it's a compounding problem. The more time we wait, the stronger the defences will be and the more men will be in those defences. So we have to push on. The problem with that, of course, is we don't know where they are. We don't know where the Turkish defenders are, and most of them are hidden in gullies and little woods and all over the landscape.
But they certainly know where the French are, because the French are there in blue uniforms and sort of and funny hats.
Yeah, the French, and we should do a big nod to the French. The French were in the sector on the right, which faced this huge obstacle called the Kerevsdare. It was a huge valley that they had to cross in any attack. And here the Turks had established a very strong line because they looked down over this valley that the French would have to cross. But again, early stages of the war, inexperienced troops. The French were wearing their traditional outfits, the bright red trousers, the sky blue jackets, the white hats, and they just stood out like beacons on the battlefield. So I saw some Turkish accounts and some German accounts, because there were some German soldiers there as well, that said you just couldn't miss them. They just stood out like beacons as they tried to get across this valley. So the French lost in all these attacks that we're talking about, not just the second battle where the Anzacs were involved. The French lost horrendous numbers of men. And over the course of the campaign, as a nod to the French lost more men killed than the Australians and New Zealanders combined at Gallipoli. It's a huge contribution that we, most of us, including the French, tend to overlook these days.
In fact, when the Australians are called up and they go after the Kiwis, the Kiwis go first in one campaign, like the charge of the Light Brigade. The New Zealanders go first and they get wiped out, and they come back and they're told to go again.
Yeah, so basically the battle that we talk about in the book lasted 3 days, May 6, 7 and 8. 6th of May, British troops attack, and there's these complicated plans that they're going to capture the village of Krithia and the hill beside it called Archie Baba. Again, the objectives for the first day. We won't worry about that. We're going to capture them today. The British expected that on the 6th of May, by that evening, they would have captured these objectives and they'd be planning the next move. It was a disaster. The men advanced into fire. They were not coordinated. The artillery support was terrible. And the British and French troops that attacked on the 6th of May got completely wiped out. Now we fast forward to the 7th of May. And in some ways, I think the decision to attack on the 7th of May is potentially the most criminal aspect of this whole thing, because the attack had gone terribly on the 6th of May. They'd only captured a few hundred metres of ground. The issue now was that the troops that had advanced across no man's land had dug in on a new front line. So that's the new British and French front line. The issue was, though, that the Turks were on the high ground and had full observation across the entire Allied sector. The troops that came in to attack on the 7th of May had to cross the ground, the same ground their comrades had the previous day. So they were coming under fire from the moment they left their support areas in the rear. Mm-hmm. And most of the casualties on the 7th of May occurred with the troops just trying to get to their new front line.
And no suggestion they go at night.
Well, there was a brief suggestion, but then it got ignored. They said, oh no, they're too disorganised. Their officers won't know what to do in the dark. They've got to go in the day, 10 a.m., 11 a.m., So you get these terrible scenes of men being mown down by machine gun fire, just trying to get to their own front line. It's horrific and terrible. The survivors get to the front line and manage to push it a little bit further forward. So now we have a new front line, which is another 100, 200 yards closer to the Turks. They still haven't seen the Turks. The fire has come from hidden positions. They're calling this an advance to contact, is the rather innocuous term, which is horrific, which means just advance until you get shot at, and then we'll know where the enemy is. It was just awful. And so that's the 6th and the 7th of May, and at that stage, the attack should have been called off.
Okay, so the Kiwis have gone twice.
Well, the Kiwis, so this is just the British and French on
Yep.
the 6th and 7th of May, and then on the 8th of May, I cannot understand why. I have no answer to this question, why after 2 days of slaughter, they sent in the Anzacs on the 8th of May. But so the 8th of May is the day as Anzacs that we care about. So the New Zealanders were sent in first, as you say.
And they go twice.
On their own, yeah, twice.
Back and go again.
On their own,
Yep.
just the one New Zealand brigade.
Yep.
So on the previous days, at least they'd sent in 2 or 3 or 4 brigades on a wider front. For some reason on the 8th, they just decided they were going to send in just the New Zealanders.
There's that moment in the film Gallipoli in which up at the Neck or at Lone Pine, the Aussies say to their mates goodbye and they go over the top and they get mowed down. Yeah. This is arguably worse. What happens here
I think you're right. I think the only benefit, if we can use that term, the New Zealanders had is they didn't realise that they were going to go in just on their own. They didn't realise. And it actually briefly worked because the Turks were quite surprised to just see one brigade advancing very quickly on its own, but they soon got their axe together and started mowing the Kiwis down. I think that situation was definitely the case for the Aussies because they'd seen the British, and there was a bit of where the Aussies had been camped, there was a bit of a hill beside the camp. So they had been able to climb up on the hill and like watching the battle as if on a map. They had watched the French attack. They'd watched the British attack over 2 days, and then the New Zealanders attack. And now it was the Aussie turn. So I think by this stage they kind of knew that. I think the Australians didn't realise they were going to participate because they're
having a meal, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, the Aussie commanders said, "Well, it's been a disaster. No one's gotten anywhere. We're at the end of the day, so late on the day of the 8th of May, and they're like, it's been a whole disaster. The whole thing's been a shambles. You know, we're not going to play any role in this attack." And so they're in the reserve area, just sitting down to their evening meal just before 5 p.m. And extraordinarily, they get an order saying, "You're attacking."
With 35 minutes notice.
Yeah, but they got the order at 4:55 p.m. to attack at 5:30 p.m.
And the farce goes on. Again, the British say to them, we need to reassure the French that we're attacking alongside them. Do you have any bands? Can you make a noise?
Yeah, it's farcical. Again, you couldn't write this stuff, could you, if you're writing a fiction? The order came in to Colonel Mackay, who was the commander of the Australian 2nd Brigade, from his commanding officer, his British commanding officer. Do you have any bands with you? Can a brass band lead the attack with flags flying and trumpets blaring and drums beating?
Yeah.
Can that lead the attack off to lift the spirits of the men as they march into machine gun fire?
It's the stuff of satire, isn't it?
It's just ridiculous. I do want to say at this point, Ray, that I am someone who does not conform to this idea of the British bungling general sending the Anzacs to their deaths. In general, in the First World War. Overall, I just don't think that's a fair picture to paint of the entire First World War. However, you can find some specific examples of that, and there's no better example than the Battle of Krithia. The suggestion that the Australians would march into machine gun fire, where literally thousands of men are lying dead on the plain in front of them, with a brass band leading the way, is just it's beyond comprehension.
Yes, and in fact, the Anzacs, the New Zealanders, then the Aussies, lose about half their men that first day.
Yeah, so what happens is, the New Zealanders have attacked twice in the morning and in the afternoon of the 8th of May. The Australians are sent in to support them. And it's one of the most heroic and futile advances Australians will ever participate in during the war. The 2nd Brigade, so the 4 battalions of the 2nd Brigade, so the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th battalions, all line up, spread out across this exposed plain and begin moving forward. They begin moving forward, rushing forward, not walking, but moving forward pretty quickly, with their objective simply capture the village of Krithia. This objective that dozens of battalions have been mowed down trying to take. Now we've got 4 Australian battalions on their own, just advancing across this plain. And exactly the same thing happened. The Turkish machine guns open up, the artillery, the riflemen, and the Australians get cut down from a Turkish enemy they can't even see. They don't even know where the fire is coming from. And just incredible descriptions of the horror and the bravery of this, what was a completely futile advance.
Including James Mackay, who, despite the fact that he then goes to Fromelles and again is in charge of one of the great disasters of ever in Australian history, but he's very brave here, leading the men into death.
Yeah, I always have a bit of mixed feelings about Mackay, and he just seemed to he just seemed to piss everyone off, basically. That was his big issue. He just didn't get on with anyone, and so therefore he was always a scapegoat. But he actually he's the colonel in charge of the entire brigade, and because it had been such a rush, I mean, Charles Bean, the official historian, said that no other attack in the entire First World War, Australian attack, had been organised at such short notice. 35 minutes, it's ridiculous. And Mackay, because it was so disorganised, the colonel actually went out and led from the front. And Mackay was incredibly brave at Krithia. He led from the front. He ordered his men onwards when they were struggling. And eventually, late in the day, he got shot in the leg. And it kept him out. You know, that it was a painful wound that he lived with for the rest of his life. So Mackay couldn't be faulted for his bravery. But he was, after the battle, a bit of the scapegoat for the men who just didn't like him and thought he should have done more to keep them safe.
And he then doubles the felony at Fromelles, leads the worst day in Australian history.
Yeah, absolutely. When they lost 5,500 men in our first action on the Western Front, so he was always the wrong man in the wrong place. And I don't think history should blame him as much as we do, but he was just that kind of guy that just annoyed everyone no end, and therefore was the logical scapegoat.
You mentioned Charles Bean, again the great historian, also the man who's responsible for the Australian War Memorial. He's very brave. He plays a critical role there, goes to the front. And then when he comes back after the war and sees the dead bodies of the Australians that are still there, it obviously is a special moment, a special battlefield for him.
Yeah, I love these personal elements, Ray. That's what makes a great story is the people involved. And Bean, a really interesting bloke that I've always been fascinated in, was so entangled in the story of Krithia. It's ludicrous. He said himself that he knew this battlefield of Krithia better than any other battlefield of the war, with the possible exception of Pozières in France, simply because he'd been across it so many times during the battle. So he was there as the correspondent, armed only with a pencil, and yet he advanced with the troops. He was supposed to stay in the rear area and just write notes, just observe and write notes. He advanced in the front line. There's an account I put in the book where some soldiers were lying flat out in the dirt holding a shovel in front of their face and watched Bean walk past them to keep going to follow the advance. So the soldiers themselves are lying in the dirt trying not to get shot. Bean's standing and walking. So incredibly heroic. He rescued a man. He helped Mackay when Mackay was wounded, the colonel. And he was even recommended for the Military Cross for his work in rescuing wounded and helping out, which he didn't get because technically he was a civilian, so he couldn't be awarded that. But incredible. And so Krithia was really important to Bean. It was one of the most important experiences he'd seen the Australians participate in during the war.
And when he goes back after the war, again, as I say, there are still the bones of Australian and New Zealand soldiers there and the others. It's especially poignant, especially sad for him, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this is part of the idea, the genesis of the War Memorial came to him on that barren plain at Krithia, because this is early 1919 now. The war's over. So for the first time, Charles Bean can go anywhere on the battlefields without risking getting killed. And so he goes to Gallipoli. So he assembles this team that he calls the Australian Historical Mission, that included the war artist George Lambert and the photographer Hubert Wilkins. And they go back to Gallipoli to answer what being called the mysteries of the campaign, the riddles of the campaign. And they spent a lot of time at Anzac, but also they went to Krithia to walk the ground and to try and get an understanding of what had gone so wrong on the 8th of May, 1915. And he was horrified when he got there that the bodies of the Australians who'd been killed were still just lying out on the plain where they died. Well,
with
their
skeletons.
He said he found fragments of uniforms with the Australia rising sun on them, and the colour patches of the battalions that had attacked, and their bones, the bones of hundreds of Australians still lying out in the field.
And
so
this
he
is
collected.
2 years after.
This is 3 years later.
3 years.
This is actually nearly 4 years later. So he, Bean actually collected a lot of those relics, including there's a couple of tattered scraps of fabric from uniforms of Australians that have been killed that are still in the collection of the War Memorial. I've seen them. It's quite moving.
All right, we'll wrap it up because it's an extraordinary story. But you make the point that Krithia is a critical moment in Gallipoli, that they see only a couple of weeks into the whole war, that they see it's hopeless. At that stage, they realise that they're never going to win.
Yeah, I suppose you could say from a strategic position, from the British position, the thing that amazed me most is when I was researching this is we know that the Gallipoli campaign changed from offence to defence, basically, that at some point during the campaign the Allies realised that their plans for this big attack and sweeping up the peninsula wasn't going to work, so they had to dig in and defend and try and hold their gains. I didn't realise how early it occurred in the campaign. I would have said it was sort of maybe midway through the campaign. No, after the Second Battle of Krithia, after the terrible advances of 6, 7 and 8th of May, so 10 days into the campaign, the next orders that Hamilton gives from the High Command were dig in, prepare for stalemate, bring up your artillery machine guns to defend the trenches. It happened after the Second Battle of Krithia. So by the 8th of May, this really was the turning point of the Gallipoli campaign, where the Allies went from offence to defence. And in spite of, they tried to kick it off again in August with the famous August offensive, but except for that, this really marked sort of the closing stages of Allied attempts to advance. They kept trying to capture Krithia. So in June and July, they launched other attacks to try and capture Krithia. All of those unsuccessful as well. But I was amazed just at this turning point. The Second Battle of Krithia really was a turning point in the Gallipoli campaign.
It's a turning point too for the Anzacs. The Kiwis and the Aussies had been almost rivals and didn't especially like each other until then. They realised they've got huge respect for each other.
Yeah, they'd had a pretty checkered history during training in Egypt. They had not gotten along very well. They forged some strong bonds during the landing and during the early days at Gallipoli, fighting in the Anzac sector. But this was really the thing that cemented that bond, because the New Zealanders and the Australians were fighting side by side, the two Anzac forces together in this desperate and bloody advance at Krithia. And this was really the thing that cemented that relationship, what we would call that Anzac Spirit, which lasted not only for the rest of the war, but on to today.
So, Matt, it's almost my first question, is the last question now as well. You've done the research on this. Why is it forgotten? It's such a compelling story when you go to the detail that you've gone to, and yet it remains in my library of Gallipoli books, it remains unknown.
I think for two reasons. Firstly, it was a disaster, and we try not to celebrate our disasters too strongly, particularly since the First World War was eventually a victory. You know, we don't want to dwell too much on the disasters. But I think also because it was, in the big scheme of things, it was insignificant. You know, those men did effectively die for nothing. They died advancing against machine guns that they couldn't see, against trenches they had no hope of capturing. So the Second Battle of Krithia was insignificant. It was pointless. And therefore, it's just really slipped through the cracks of history. And battles like Lone Pine, which we can see a reason why they went in, or the brave futility of the Neck, or the August offensive against Chunuk Bair, or even the landing. You know, these have purpose, they have meaning. We can show gains for sacrifice. There's just none of that at Krithia. It's just, come on, lads, you know, grab your rifle and let's go.
And I'll see you later.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
So just a horrific story. So I'm glad that hopefully we're shining a bit of light on the shadows of Krithia, and hopefully it'll be better well known than it is.
Well, thank you. Thanks for writing. Thanks for doing the research. I must say, as I read it in 2 nights, it was that compelling. I couldn't put the story down, and I thought I'd read everything I wanted to read about Gallipoli. So you've really shone a light in there, and thanks for doing it.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.